I'm endlessly fascinated and curious about the world around us, about business, about politics, about the arts, about culture, developments, social issues, and the people. Most importantly, about the people that are shaping our future. Every night, I get the opportunity to have conversations, to dive into conversations with thought leaders, with change makers, entrepreneurs, politicians, and everyday heroes who unpack the ideas and stories that I think matter to all of us. What's the future of our economy? What's the future of our country? How do we build stronger communities? What can we learn from music, theater, sports, politics, the arts? How does policy shape our real lives? What does leadership look like, real leadership in today's environment? If it's interesting and relevant and topical and we're talking about it, you'll hear about it here at 6 o'clock on the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. I want to have real conversations, in-depth conversations. These are ideas we're sharing. This is the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. Thanks for joining me. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. I've got Anders Aslund with me today. He's a senior fellow at the Stockholm Free World Forum, and he's an adjunct professor at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. Anders Aslund is a frequent critic of U.S. government economic policy. He's written extensively on this. I follow him on LinkedIn, and his almost hourly posts, if not hourly, at least several times a day posts are very critical of U.S. government current tariff and trade policy, and also in regards to policies regarding, Europe, NATO, Ukraine, etc. Professor Aslund, thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you. My pleasure.
So tell me, what do you think is wrong with Ukraine? Sorry, not with Ukraine, with U.S. Economic policy today?
Well, pretty much everything. But if we take the tariff policy that has now become dominant, first of all, there's no theory behind it. And there's no theory of massive protectionism. This is the protectionism that we last saw being introduced in 1930 in the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act with tariffs around 20%. And the tariffs are being paid by the population. That means by Americans. And
so is it a sales tax effectively?
Yeah, it is a sales tax. Added to other sales tax, federal sales tax, and it's regressive.
I was in Florida recently on business and had dinner with numerous people, and we were commenting about this, and they said no, there's no inflation. Inflation is exactly the same as it was before, so we're not paying it. The companies or the foreigners are eating
it. Two problems with that. The first is that the tariffs have not been fully implemented yet. And second, that many importers had had stocked up before. So they are still using selling goods that has no tariff on top of them. And then thirdly, inflation is rising. Inflation is now 2.7%, and it's supposed to be 2%. That is the Fed target. So there is no theory behind the tariff policy, and it's extremely aggressive. This is a trade war, and it's being pursued in a completely arbitrary fashion. So Switzerland gets a 39% tariff, Britain gets a 10% tariff, the EU 15%. India thought they had a deal, but then they got 25% tariff. Switzerland thought they had a deal of 10%, and then they got 39%. So it's both that it's aggressive and that it's completely arbitrary. But Trump puts up a finger and says, "Okay, now I don't like this country, so we impose a massive tariff on them. For example, 50% tariff on Brazil, just because Trump likes the former president Bolsonaro and not the current president Lula. in fact, the US has a trade surplus on Brazil. So this is arbitrary, there's no theory, and it's highly disruptive. It's aggressive. This is a trade war. And Trump calls these tariffs reciprocal, while they are aggressive and unilateral and unjustified. So he's now destroying the global trading system that has been built up around the GATT and the World Trade Organization after World War II for no reason other than his aggressive emotions.
Well, if you read Art of the Deal, is what everyone says. His whole philosophy is you take an extremist position and you negotiate incredibly hard, and in the end, you'll get a great deal. If you're reasonable in your negotiations and you take a moderate point of view, you'll lose. And he wants manufacturing jobs to come back to the United States. He thinks that numerous different countries, if not, frankly, almost every country in the world is running a trade surplus with the United States. The U.S. has a trade deficit. He wants that corrected. And he's also getting, $500 billion worth of commitments of investments in the United States. So, if you read his press, it's working. He's getting the EU to pay a huge tariff. And therefore restrict imports into the United States. He's going to get manufacturing reshored from Europe to the United States, and he's getting Europe to buy, hundreds of millions of dollars of energy from the United States. So isn't that a good deal?
No, everything in it is wrong. To begin with, there is not a big trade deficit of the United States. So if you take, for example, between the European Union and the US, if you include service trade, which Trump never does, and intellectual property, then you have a balanced trade between the EU and the US. Financial Times has written substantially about this matter. So the basic assumption is wrong. And if there is a trade deficit, it is a current account deficit when we include service, and it's not a giant deficit, but a moderate one. And the cause of it is that the US has a budget deficit over 6% of GDP. And this is then financed by foreigners. So rather than saying that foreigners are ripping off the United States, Trump should be grateful and say, thank you very much, foreigners, that you trust the US so much that you want to put so much money into our country. This has happened. And foreign investments in US securities, both bonds and stocks, are in the order of $32 trillion. So approximately the level of the US GDP. Of the $29 trillion of US treasuries that are outstanding, foreigners own about $9 trillion. So what is likely to happen now is that foreigners will buy less of US treasuries because the US is not reliable. And we are already seeing that investment is going down. In the second quarter numbers of the GDP that just came out, business investment was down by 15%. That's a big number because you don't stop business investment that fast. This is without inventory. So he is doing the opposite. And then Trump talks about these trillions of dollars. I think he's now up to $9 trillion that he claims that he is getting commitments on. These are no commitments. This is loose talk. But sometime in the distant future, we might invest a little bit in the US. And then Trump gets happy. So this is not how policy should be made, and this is not proper statistics. And we saw now last week when it turns out that the US had only got 35,000 new jobs a month during the last 3 months. Then immediately he sacks the head of the Bureau of Labor Statistics. So Trump works on no facts, no theory, and sheer aggression. And this is aggression against allies and friends more than against, say, Russia or China. So what he's doing is he's alienating all his former allies and breaking up the Western alliance system and breaking up the global trading system. This will be very costly economically and politically.
I saw an interview with former Vice President and presidential candidate Kamala Harris recently, and she said the thing that had surprised her the most is that American people, American institutions, American business people have sort of put up with this all and haven't complained about it and are giving in to Trump's policies. What do you think of? And she even complained about economists that people like you weren't explaining things as succinctly as you have. What do you think? Have American institutions, American people, American business, American law firms, American universities sort of complied with Trump and not complained the way that you think they should?
Yeah, I think that that is a very justified criticism, and this is something that I think many people wonder about. Why are people, as Tim Snyder puts it, obeying in advance? Why are they obeying even before it has been done? If you take, for example, the former head of the FBI, he resigned in advance for no good reason. Trump wanted to have him exchanged, and then he just withdrew. And these 9 law firms that have put up almost $1 billion in so-called pro bono work for Trump causes, there's no reason for them to behave like this. And I'm happy to see that we are now losing top lawyers because a lawyer doesn't work for a law firm that doesn't even want to defend itself. How could anybody have confidence in a law firm that is so defeatist? So there you see one effect, but what is really terrible, it is all this money that is coming from the state that is now being, from the federal government, that is now being cut. So what is happening to Harvard, I think, is most important. And we see how many levers that the federal government can use. First, $2 billion of annual research funds, mainly going to medical research, then cutting off the right of the university to get foreign students, that they won't get visas if they apply or study at Harvard. And then the federal government can take away the accreditation of the university, and on like this it goes. So what we are seeing is that the federal government has far too many levels of power, and if you go against the government, you are in trouble. And we are seeing, with regard to the media, how Trump, as he had promised before, used libel and defamation laws in order to go after media that are critical of him. ABC and CBS have been forced to give him $15 and $16 million respectively for completely flawed defamation cases. And Trump collects this to his a Trump library where he undoubtedly can spread the money as he pleases later on to families, members. So this is a new system of censorship. According to World Press Freedom Report by Reporters Without Borders for last year, the US ranked 57 in the world in terms of press freedom, which is not very free. The US comes below all EU countries, apart from Hungary, which is, of course, Trump's ideal because it doesn't have much freedom. So even before Trump, the federal government had so many checks on freedom in the US that it ranked at the bottom of democratic countries. And now Trump is about to, or perhaps already, have switched the US from being in the democratic camp to be in the gray zone of not completely free countries.
You mean the what zone?
In the gray zone of countries that are not quite free. Freedom House still keeps the US as a free country, but it is on the lowest level in their measurement.
So do you think the United States is an autocracy today?
It's slipping down in that area. You have a big gray area where countries are not fully democratic. So what happens now is that Trump can sue anybody and does so systematically. If you compare with what Vladimir Putin did when he came in 2000, Trump is moving much faster against the big television companies than Putin did.
Trump is moving faster against the big television companies than even Vladimir Putin did.
Yeah.
Really.
Russia was quite free during Putin's first term.
We're going to take a break for some message. This is going to be a hard-hitting conversation today with Professor Anders Aslund. We're going to take a break and be back in just 2 minutes. Stay with us, everyone. Back in 2. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. I've got Anders Aslund with me today. He is a professor. He's got really quite a very impressive background. He's got a Bachelor's of Arts in History, Russian, Polish, Political Science from Stockholm University. He's got a master's degree in economics from Stockholm School of Economics, and he's got a University of Oxford PhD, I presume, in economics. And then he's got really quite an incredible history. He was the first secretary for the Swedish permanent delegation to the United States. He was the first secretary of the Embassy of Sweden in Moscow for 2 years in the 1980s. That must have been a fascinating time to have been serving in Moscow, sir. Then he was a professor in the Stockholm School of Economics, a guest scholar at the Brookings Institution in Washington, a senior fellow and director of the Russian and Eurasian program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, a senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics, a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council, and today he serves as a senior fellow and professor, adjunct professor at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. What was it like serving in Moscow right before the fall of the Berlin Wall?
Well, it was fascinating. Things were happening all the time. I was there 84 to 87, so I came just before Gorbachev became Secretary General of the Communist Party in March 1985. And it was Gorbachev who drove it all during the first 3 years. But so everything that was considered impossible became not only possible, but actually happened. And in particular, what drove the intellectual debate was the thick literary journals, which are like books, and like the Granta journal, if you know. And each month they came out with one devastating article that shattered what had been the truth before. I, of course, looked mainly on the economic side, but it was very much about history, and to reveal Stalin's terrible deeds. At the same time, the KGB was hard-hitting. I got my car sabotaged 8 times. So the KGB came simply and emptied my tires when they thought that I had done something that I shouldn't do. If I had seen some Russian whom they thought that I shouldn't see, but they emptied my tires on the car. If I really misbehaved,
even though you were a diplomat.
Yeah, doesn't matter. It has been like that all the time. They go into the apartments and they leave signs that they were there. For example, a cigarette, or what they do is, for example, going into a bathroom and not flushing after they have used the toilets, just to show that they were there. These are typical things that the KGB did and does. So at the end, I was, in the summer of 1987, that is the KGB, took in my acquaintances and friends for interrogation. And we heard from various people that it was between 3 and 12 hours interrogation. And one of the toughest took note of all the names and said that there were 33 people who that they had interrogated, that he could judge from his conversation. And I had a dinner once for Poles, and all the 3 Poles who were in the apartment were expelled after this dinner. One of them was head of a Polish television in Moscow at the time. So it was a very tough place. What people said, Moscow is interesting, but it's not pleasant.
So this was the 1987. 2 years later, you had the fall of the Berlin Wall. 5 years later, you had the breakup of the Soviet Union. In 1987, did you have any sense, given what you've just described of how powerful the KGB was, etc., did you have any sense in 1987 that 2 years later the Berlin Wall could fall and 5 years later the USSR could break up?
Yeah, sure. So one saw, on the one hand, that things were moving in one direction. On the other hand, one could feel the old repression was still very much present. A major event was, for example, when Andrei Sakharov, the Nobel Peace laureate and the father of atom bomb in the Soviet Union, when he was allowed back to Moscow in 1986. And he became then effectively the leader of the intellectual opposition in the Soviet Union. This was a major event, but there were lots of these kinds of events. And popular demonstrations started in 1987. And what we actually as diplomats could do was to go to certain public lectures. And they started then having open discussions in 1987. But it was very interesting to see how people were not used to speak their mind. Therefore, they got extremely excited when they got the opportunity. And they lost control over themselves and started shouting, etc. What you see from people who are not used to public speaking. So it was a very confused situation.
So I'm not in any way, shape, or form suggesting that the United States is the USSR, but given the current situation that you've described and that Kamala Harris described, that law firms and universities and companies and billionaires and economists, etc., are effectively not opposing Donald Trump and his policies. And 2 days ago, just to put it in perspective, you posted, "No serious economist would advocate Trump's devastating economic policies. One, high tariffs for no reason. Two, complete uncertainty. Three, massive overstimulation with rising budget deficit and public debt. Four, hostility to the whole world. No surprise the economy declines." Is there a leader of the intellectual opposition right now to Donald Trump and his economic policies?
Good question. No, there is not. I mean, people who stand up and who are relevant. I would mention Larry Summers, the former Treasury Secretary, as one of the people who's most vocal and most consistent in his criticism. You have Paul Krugman in the few, but there's no clear leader. And if you look up on the Democratic Party, you wonder, where are all the old leaders? This that Kamala Harris, as you mentioned, that she spoke is a major thing at all. But otherwise, it's a number of senators. Whom I particularly like is the senator of Connecticut, Chris Murphy, who's very consistent in his legal criticism. Sheldon Whitehouse focuses on the corrupt side of the business. And of course, the harder people, AUC and the radicals, but there's no leader.
You say that no surprise the economy declines. Stock market is an all-time high. GDP is still growing. Unemployment is low. Inflation, even though it may be up from what you wanted, what the Fed is targeting, it's still low. So is the economy actually declining today, or is the stock market saying the economy is doing great?
The stock market, I don't think that one should pay too much attention to. It has very little to do with how the economy works. What economists pay most attention to in terms of actual economic growth, it is private sales, which increased by 1.9% in the first quarter and 1.2% in the second quarter. It's still increasing, but this is a very low growth rate. So what the US seems to have now is stagflation, as in the 1970s. Inflation is still limited, slightly below 3%. And growth, I would presume, will stop at 1% or so this year, but it could get worse.
We're going to take a break for some messages and come back and talk about deficits, because that one of the things that our professor has been very critical as well is this overstimulation of the economy. And then we're going to touch on what's going on in Europe, because he's also been very critical of the United States plans and policies in regards to Ukraine. Stay with us, everyone. We'll be just back in 2 minutes. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. I've got Professor Anders Aslund with us today. He's got just an unbelievable career that we've talked about, where he spent time at the United Nations, in academia, in Moscow, and now he's at Georgetown University as an adjunct professor, and he's a big critic of U.S. economic policy and Donald Trump's policies right now. I want to turn to another one that you mentioned. You talk about overstimulation with rising budget deficit and public debt. This big, beautiful bill has dramatically increased the deficit and debt, and it was put in place by the Republicans. And I always thought, maybe naively, that Republicans, conservatives were for balancing the budget, and you know, the Peterson Center that you were part of, you know, numerous years ago. You know, I think published a whole book at one point in time about deficits and debt and how that could destroy the U.S. economy, but it doesn't seem to worry the president or the Republican Party. So please explain to me what's going on where these conservatives are increasing debt and deficit to over, you know, 5% of GDP.
Yeah, if you look upon it historically, for the last 45 years, it has been the Republicans that have had big deficits and increased the public debt. Ronald Reagan started it. George W. Bush pushed not financing the war in Iraq. And then Obama was no saint in this regard, but Trump sharply increased the deficit in his last period. So by and large, you can say that the three big sinners are Reagan, George W. Bush, and Trump. And the Republicans have voted for their expenditures, but they have not voted for the Democrats' expenditure. The person who really changed things was Bill Clinton. So Bill Clinton had in his last 2 years actually overbalanced budget. And Clinton stands out as the only real fiscal conservative. And for the last 25 years, we have seen a steadily increasing public debt. And as public debt is normally counted, it's now 124% of GDP, which is a lot. And so this is at the level of Italy, which is one of the most dangerous European countries. And it's worse because the US has relatively high interest rates. So therefore, the debt costs much more. It costs more than $1 trillion a year in debt service. And it's now increasing fast. So with this new tax bill that Trump has pushed through, the public debt would increase to about 150% of GDP in 2035. Of course, it will not happen like this, but this is a dangerous situation. And previously, foreigners have been happy to buy US treasuries because it has been the gold standard. But what is the safest thing you can buy in the world? US treasuries. And now that is no longer the case because Trump and his advisors are discussing transforming foreign holdings of US treasuries into something else. And that means they're essentially discussing defaulting on the US public debt and partial confiscation of foreign holdings. And that will scare people away from US treasuries. So this is a completely mad policy, and it will cost a lot. So you can see now that the interest rates in the US are much higher than in Europe, about twice as high. And this is not the problem of the Fed, it's a problem of Trump.
But if what you're saying is true, interest rates should go up even higher as foreigners don't want to finance the debt. And if there's any chance of default or confiscation, one would think that there'd be massive sales of U.S. treasuries right now.
Well, true, but it doesn't work quite like that. If you think of who holds this, it's enormous funds. Insurance companies, pension funds, and they move funds very slowly. So there's an enormous amount of inertia. So it's more that they don't buy new stuff while they hold what they have. And it's also not, this is a discussion, it's not concrete proposals. So people don't take it seriously as yet. And Rudi Dornbusch, the late MIT professor, he used to say that financial crises normally take much longer to develop than anybody had anticipated. But when they start, they move much faster than anybody could have believed. And this is the nature of financial crisis. It takes time to build up, and building up, it is what we are seeing now. And then the crisis itself happens much later than we would have expected. So I'm very cautious never to predict when a crisis will come. I'll give you one example. In 2012, I went to Cyprus because Greece had defaulted on its government bonds, and the Cyprus banks held vast amounts of Greek bonds. And I went to a couple of the banks and asked them about this problem, and they said, "Oh, we will be bought by some foreign bank. We are not really in trouble." And they did not have a crisis in front of them, although it was obvious that the capital was already gone. And but nothing had happened as yet. And then a year later, everything crashed. And it was so obvious that it would crash. But the central bank in Cyprus and the banks I visited had no sense of crisis at all.
I want to turn to your thoughts about the EU and Ukraine. You wrote in the Kiev Post, the European Union and Ukraine are facing a bizarre conundrum: how to handle a narcissistic and lawless senile toddler who has become the almighty president of the United States. The European Union and Ukraine are facing a bizarre conundrum. Traditionally, the United States has stood for democracy, freedom, the rule of law, and free markets, but Mr. Trump's preferences are personal power, family income, and maximum public attention. How shall the democratic world manage such a character? The big takeaway is never trust the United States as long as Trump is president. Remember that he has claimed that our allies are worse than our enemies. In the short term, Trump has to be managed. In the longer term, all need to learn how to live without the previously benevolent United States. The EU needs to provide Ukraine with sufficient financing, and together Europe and Ukraine must provide Ukraine with the necessary arms. Wow. That's pretty hard-hitting, sir.
Oh, really?
You then go through 4 different case studies of people who have handled Trump, from the president of El Salvador to Viktor Orban to the NATO Secretary General, and finally China. Tell me about these 4 different case studies and what you think the world can learn from how to deal with Trump. And obviously, given that you're talking to a Toronto audience right now, primarily, sir, I'm interested in what you have learned from these 4 case studies, what your advice to the EU and Ukraine is, and what your advice to Canada would be, given that we're in a pretty difficult situation with Donald Trump right now as well.
Yeah, I don't want to give advice or recommendation, but it's interesting to see what has worked. I mean, the president of El Salvador, Nayib Bukele, he has gone in and given Trump serious services through his prisons and his lack of rule of law. This is what Trump really likes. So this is one model to be very close to Trump. Viktor Orban shows Trump how you can cut down the media and the universities, setting an example for Trump. That's also something that Trump likes. So in Europe, Orban is a great favorite. It doesn't matter that Orban has also great relations with China, and supports Chinese direct investment in Hungary, and that the economic performance recently in Hungary has been quite bad. Trump doesn't care about that. Mark Rutte, the Secretary General of NATO, is another case, and generally the NATO summit in The Hague in June, that is just to flatter Trump. Flatter works with Trump. And you may say now, after the tariffs have come through, that the European Union looks comparatively good with 15% tariffs, while by and large people cringed seeing the president of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, coming to try Trump in Turnberry in Scotland at his golf club, and behaving like a little school girl who is allowed to see the headmaster. And it was such a humiliation, which was reflected in lots of European articles. But then perhaps that actually worked. And then we have China, which is in another situation, that they have rare metals and magnets that they effectively have a supply monopoly on. And Trump thinks that the US needs these. So therefore he's prepared to do pretty much anything to get these. And therefore, for example, the president of Taiwan is not allowed to land in New York on a trip to Latin America. And a meeting with the Taiwanese Minister of Defense planned at Pentagon in June was cancelled because the Americans don't want to go against the Chinese. So you have here two models if we turn to Canada, what would be possible. One is hardball, to play like China does. And I would suggest that that would be the best model for Canada. That is, Canada supplies a lot of oil to the US. If the US doesn't cut down the 35% tariff to, say, 15%, then Canada would stop delivering oil to the US. I don't know how legally that would be done, since these are private companies, etc. But this is the kind of hardball that the Chinese play, and that seems to work with Trump. The other would be to disgustingly compliment Trump, which I don't think is very likely to work. And where you don't want to be is in the neutral middle, where you are neither a close Trump supporter nor hardball playing opponent. That's what Trump does not like. So think of poor Switzerland now being forced to pay 39% tariffs on or US importers will be forced to pay 39% tariffs on whatever they import from Switzerland. So then it's much better to import from the European Union, where it's only 15%.
We're going to take a break and come back with some final comments from our guest tonight, our expert guest, economist Anders Aslund. We're going to ask him what he thinks is going to happen and his prediction. Stay with us, everyone. Back in 2 minutes. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. We've got economist adjunct professor at Georgetown University, Anders Aslund, with us today. It's been a fascinating discussion today, sir. I wonder if you could predict where we're going to go, what's going to happen. You know, you were there in Moscow, and you said that you could anticipate some of the trends that were happening in regards to the breakup of the Eastern Bloc and of the USSR. You say there's some intellectual opposition right now to what Donald Trump is doing, but the Republican Party seems completely wedded to his strategies. My sense is that the people that I meet with from a business standpoint that were MAGA enthusiasts are still MAGA enthusiasts, and his base is strongly supportive of him. The stock market is at a high, and while you say it may not be a great barometer of what's happening, a lot of people keep saying, look at the stock market. Trump keeps saying, look at the stock market. He seems to think that the stock market is almost better than public opinion polls as to predicting how well he's doing. While you comment that inflation is going up, 2.9% is relatively good relative to where we were during the pandemic. The economy is still growing. You say stagflation, but we're still growing. What's going to happen? Are people just going to put up with Trump and we're going to have a Great Depression like the 1930s? Are we going to have stagflation like Japan in the last 20 years? Is that NATO going to break up? Is the World Trading Organization going to break up? Or is someone going to stand up to Trump and things are going to change?
Well, I think that it's easiest to start with the multilateral organizations. They are losing out now. The World Trade Organization is, in practice, dead. I think the best thing would be simply to expel the US from it, or that the US withdraws, so that the rest of the world can maintain the free trade system. It's quite interesting that there seems to be no other country in the world that wants to have a Trump system. So it's only the US that is becoming protectionist. It's not an international trend. The UN, I think, is pretty dead. And during the spring meetings on the IMF and the World Bank, there was great worry that the US would withdraw from them. That didn't happen. NATO, I think, is in a transitionary stage and is not likely to survive. But it's quite important for Ukraine now that NATO functions. And in effect, it has got a new role now to deliver arms for Ukraine, which are very much welcome. In the US, I can't say. It depends on so many things that I can't judge. The Epstein files, for example, seem to be the big thing that really upset a lot of Republicans. What will happen to the economy? These things normally take time. The US economy was in a wonderful shape when Trump came in. He arrived at a laid table, and quite often these positive forces last longer than one could have imagined. I particularly look upon the decline in business investment and what happens to private sales as major indicators. With regard to inflation, tariffs are going up, and this will be more and more of an effect. But the service economy, which is 2/3 of the economy, has very little imports in it. Imports are only 11% of GDP. So it's possible that the negative economic developments will balance out the inflation so that it does not become too striking. So that I'm cautious with. Unemployment might not increase so much, given that immigration has effectively stopped to the US now. So where normally the labor force increases by 1% a year, now it's 0%. And a lot of foreigners are withdrawing from the labor force, unknown how as yet, if they leave the country or if they disappear into the dark economy. So it's difficult to say how people will react. The stock market is to be a surprise. I didn't think that people would trust the US and Trump as much as they have proven. And the stock market is always very difficult to predict. And of course, here we have the AI boom, which is something completely different. And that is by and large not touched by Trump. Science and universities are going down, but this is a long-term trend. It's not a short-term trend. So it's easier to see the long-term trend. And what I worry most about, what will happen to the rule of law and freedom.
Dr. Professor Anders Aslund, thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate it. I think that this is a very provocative and profound conversation, and something that a lot of people have to listen to and give a lot of thought to. And I appreciate your advice to Canada about taking a hard line. I tend to agree with it. That's our show for tonight, everybody. Thank you for joining. I remind you, I'm on every Monday through Friday at 6 o'clock on 960 AM. You can stream me online from Washington, D.C. or from Sweden at www.saga960am.ca. Good night, everybody. Thank you, sir.